Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to today's seminar titled Climate Solved, Canada's Pathways to Net Zero. I'm Subhashish Ghoshal. I'm the director of TISED. Before we begin, on behalf of TISED, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people, a territory on which we are fortunate to gather today. So today's seminar is presented by Dr. Bruce Lourie, who's this year's TISED Scholar in Residence. Our Scholar in Residence program allows us to host high-profile sustainability experts to work with us, our students and partners, to advance sustainability in our thematic areas. Bruce is a best-selling author, policy expert, social entrepreneur, and award-winning global sustainability leader. In addition to serving as president of the Ivy Foundation, he's a guest lecturer at the social finance program at the TISED Business School, University of Oxford. He is active on many boards of directors and advisory boards, including the Canadian Climate Institute and the Transition Accelerator. Bruce is one of Canada's most influential leaders and experts on sustainability, and has been instrumental in creating more than a dozen organizations that play critical roles in Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy. These include the Canadian Climate Institute and Transition Accelerator, which I just mentioned, but as well as many other institutes, such as the Institute for Sustainable Finance, Farmers for Climate Solutions, Efficiency Canada, and the Summerhill Group. Dr. Lourie has played a pioneering role in connecting environmental issues to human health. Most importantly, his leadership his leadership is behind the phase out of coal-fired plants in Ontario, the single largest climate action in North America. Bruce has co-authored best-selling books, including the internationally acclaimed Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. Bruce Lourie, I'd like to express, on behalf of TISED, our sincere thanks to the Trottier Family Foundation and other benefactors that make events such as this and all of our work at TISED possible. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Lourie.
Thank you so much, Subhashish. It's been a real pleasure for me, to spend the past few months here at McGill and working with TISED. And I also want to reiterate the thanks to Lauren Trottier. I think none of us would be here without Lauren's not only, great, thank you. Lauren's generous contributions to McGill and TISED, but also Lauren's leadership through his foundation, doing marvelous work on climate change. And we work probably more closely with the Trottier Family Foundation than any other in Canada. So thank you so much, Lauren, for all of your leadership and friendship over the years. So I speak a lot on climate change, which may not surprise you. But this is the first time that I'm being somewhat bold in using the title Climate Solved. And the reason I'm saying that, as you'll see, is that we have a very good idea of where we're going to on solving climate change. There is still much that needs to be done, but I really think that, as you will see, hopefully through my presentation, that we are well on our way. So this is a mixed audience. We've got some older people and some younger people. The older people probably know who this is. I don't know if the younger people will. Clint Eastwood in this iconic film from the 1960s called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I thought I would use that to frame my presentation today. So, the good. We are making significant progress on solving climate change, and we're seeing, as I will talk in detail on, major investments, lots of progress, very good news, and even here in Canada, for the first time in, I think we can say, ever, we are seeing real progress on climate change. The bad is that we're not moving fast enough, we're not moving far enough, and we're not moving fair enough. And so we have to make sure that in everything that we do, we accelerate the pace, but we also consider how our decisions and actions are affecting people that are most vulnerable to climate change. And the ugly, but I'll just skip that for a moment until we get through the presentation. So, Lauren, I'm stealing this from you, Lauren, because you mentioned this the other night. And I think we don't often stop and think of the progress that we have made in society, everything from life expectancy to reducing extreme poverty to increasing literacy rates. So we've seen tremendous advances across the board in these fundamentally important indicators of social progress. And where I think this is important for us in climate change is it shows that we can make dramatic progress on major issues within a matter of decades. We've also seen extraordinary technological progress. And I was thinking back, if you look on the line just before 1900, when my grandfather was born, we were just still inventing the things that today seem kind of archaic, like automobiles and telephones, let alone what the technological pace of change we've seen in the last decade. So again, we've seen this extraordinary pace of technology, and I think what that shows us is we can adopt and move quickly with technological change, and we have to be in that frame of mind as we're thinking through the pace and change for climate change. Unfortunately, where we've seen a lot of significant social improvement, we've seen a lot of economic advancement and activity, the one part of the solution to sustainability that really has suffered has been the ecology and the environment. And so the graph on the bottom right for you is the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery. So Canada basically was known, probably a little longer ago when I was doing my original PhD research, but Canada was known for overseeing one of the greatest disasters of ecosystem management anywhere on the planet, and that was the decimation of the Atlantic cod fishery. So we've done a terrible job of managing natural resources. We've done a terrible job of managing biodiversity. And you can see, even with the graph on species extinction, there is a very direct correlation between the advancing human population and number of species going extinct. So this basically wasn't quite how it was written in my thesis, but this was my thesis question, which was, given what we know, why don't we act? Why aren't we doing things that we need to be doing to solve for sustainability? This also wasn't in my thesis, but it certainly answers part of it. And I'll try to, well, I was going to say I'll try to stay away from political commentary, but that's unlikely for me. But where I will revert back to, this was a fundamental report that came out that basically defined sustainability. It came out 36 years ago. It's called the Gro-Harlem-Brundtland Report, known as for the author, or Our Common Future. And it basically set up this idea that sustainability is the intersection of economy, society, and ecology, and somehow we have to find that little sweet spot in the middle where everything intersects. And the basic definition that was used in that, and the important words here are, without compromising the ability of future generations. And I think it's safe to say that we're at the point now where we actually are at risk of compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in my assessment of this presentation of sustainability is we kind of got it wrong. And this is really what sustainability needs to look like. So basically, we can't do anything outside of the boundaries of ecology and ecosystems. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need biodiversity and natural resources. Society lives within the ecology and the environment, and economy is just a creation of society to help us distribute goods and services efficiently. So we can't basically say, oh, economy's out here and let's work on that, and there's a bit of society over here and let's try to get some ecology up here. It all has to function within ecological boundaries, and that's really been, I think, fundamentally misunderstood in the history of all of our work around sustainability. Now, I'm going to zip through a little bit of this at the beginning. Just it's kind of the warm-up part of the presentation. But what I really want to do is get into some of the details around why we're succeeding on climate change, and then where some of the challenges are. But one of the fundamental, again, pieces to understand about net zero approaches to climate change is that we're not really talking just about an environmental issue. We're not talking about climate and the weather. We're talking about this massive global economic and social transition. So it's important to understand that this isn't merely or simply an environmental issue. But it's also one that involves confronting serious economic and human risk. And we're seeing, of course, in the last few weeks all across Canada, the massive forest fires, the health effects from those forest fires, and all over the world, of course, over the last 2 years, we've seen accelerated damage and harm caused by climate change. We will, though, see unprecedented economic opportunity for this transition, and huge numbers, the world potentially investing $90 trillion on infrastructure just up until the period 2030. So it's a tremendous economic opportunity for the world. And choosing successful transition pathways, which I'll talk about more in this presentation, comes with big rewards for those who get on early and do it well. So these net zero investments will enable us to transition everything from how we build buildings, how we move ourselves, how we grow food, and how we generate and use energy. So again, it's fundamental to the structure of our economy and our society. And nothing could be more expensive than getting it wrong, and we're certainly seeing more and more evidence of that. I was at a presentation quite a few years ago now where Thomas Buberl, who was the CEO of AXA, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, basically said there was sort of a debate about doing scenarios for planning for insurance. And basically he said, once you get above 3 or certainly to 4 degrees, there's no point in doing any planning. There's no point in doing any scenarios. Nothing in the world will be insurable. And so we just saw this in California unfolding last week, where, forgetting the name, State Farm, one of the big insurance companies, it was a State Farm, declared that they were going to stop insuring houses in California because of fire risk. So we're starting to see these predictions that were made a number of years ago coming true just because of the significance of climate change. And we sometimes, I think, mishear the extent to which climate risk really is about human risk. And again, I deliberately chose an older quote. There's more recent similar quotes from IPCC reports, but in 2018, the recognition that a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures will disproportionately affect disadvantaged and vulnerable populations. So of course we're seeing this happening all over the world as well, with adverse health impacts. And one of the real big risks that I don't think people are looking at right now is population displacement and human migration as a result of climate change. So how are we doing? This is sort of where we get into the positive news, but not quite totally positive yet. So how are we doing? In Canada, we're very far behind the rest of the G7. So our emissions are up 21%. The US has almost come down to their 1990 emission levels, And then if we look at Europe, and particularly the UK, with a 43% decline in their climate change emissions since 1990. And of course, there's structural reasons for these big differences in different countries. But the reality is Canada is performing quite poorly. This is the most up-to-date piece of information, and which includes the effects of the pandemic on our emissions. And you can see Canada's emissions have dropped more than almost any other country, and that's because so many of our emissions are related to oil and gas production, and with a global reduction in the demand for oil and gas, we produced less, we exported less, so our emissions went down. What's going to be fascinating is to see in a year or two whether, well, there'll certainly be an uptick, but how big will that uptick be? So right now the Canadian government is very excited that we're finally getting our emissions down. They seem to be a little blind to the fact that it's not because of all of their great policies. So, more importantly, a closer look at Canada. So, anyway, all the different targets kind of drive me crazy, but this was the Copenhagen target, which is based on a 2005 starting point. If we look at Canada, we're down 2% as a country from 2005. If we remove Alberta and Saskatchewan from Canada, we are down 15%, almost hitting our 17% Copenhagen target. And if we look at Alberta and Saskatchewan, you can see the quite dramatic effect of the oil and gas industry out west. Here's another, I think, quite striking graph, which explains why when, and a number of my colleagues here, I travel a fair bit across the country, and having a conversation about climate change in Quebec or Ontario is very different than in Alberta, and this graph shows you why. It's still, I think, quite striking. I think most people aren't aware that the single biggest climate action in Canada, which Sebastian's referenced, was Ontario phasing out coal-fired power plants, but all of that has been offset by the increase in emissions related to oil and gas production in Alberta. And of that oil and gas production, about 80% of it gets exported to the United States. So this is really what explains the challenging political dynamic we have in Canada, which is the West basically wanting to make sure that we don't just eliminate that giant red bar, which is Alberta, but with the new premier, that's probably going to be a real challenge. So, shutting down coal in Ontario. Now, let's start to more seriously get into the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the world really has finally moved from debating whether or not climate change is a problem, debating whether or not humans are the cause. We've largely, 70–80% of the public understands that climate change is a problem and understands that humans have caused this problem. So if you look at the history or the trajectory of climate change work over the last 20 or so years, 20 or 30 years when I first started, we've been moving from why do we need to take action, to what is it that we need to do, to a phase we're in now, which is how do we actually do it. So this is really important. So it's how to solve the problem, not why is it a problem or what is the problem. And related to that, we have something in Canada now called the Emissions Reduction Plan. And it's the first time that the federal government has ever had a plan to deal with climate change, remarkably. And that came out last year. And if you look at the plan, and so this is the plan to 2030, so pathway to 2030. And if you look at it, you'll see the basic emissions, and I've just highlighted at the bottom. So electricity, buildings, heavy industry, oil and gas, and transportation. They're the bulk of the problem. The other ones on the left, those incomprehensible acronyms that are mostly accounting mumbo jumbo, and then waste and others aren't ones that we're really focusing on. It's the 5 big sectors that are the ones that the emission reduction plan is focusing on. And if you look in detail, it'll show you that each of those sectors and each of the sub-plans for those sectors. So it's a very important piece of work that the federal government has done. And it also brings in this issue, or kind of conversation around pathways to net zero. And so that was the plan to 2030, where we're really looking down the road is net zero by 2050. And I'm a big fan of the whole concept of net zero pathways because it takes us beyond this kind of narrow sense of what are the incremental emissions reductions we need by this particular date, to a conversation that is, how do we actually get to net zero by 2050? Basically, how do we solve the entire problem? And so it bypasses these sort of, for me, fruitless targets and timelines debates that have really bogged down climate policy for years. And it moves from the idea of an emission reduction paradigm, which is, and to give you an example in your home, you may have an old gas furnace, and in the emission reduction paradigm, someone would say, well, your furnace is only operating at 72%. You need to get a high efficiency furnace that operates at 90%. So that's an emission reduction of X percent. Where we're going today, which is a net zero paradigm, is you need to actually remove your furnace and put in a heat pump and get rid of all the emissions associated with your furnace. So that's a big difference in thinking when you go from emission reduction to net zero. And it also gives you a sense of the time scale, because some of the decisions we're making today won't actually be implemented for 5 or 10 or 20 years. So we actually need to have a long runway to think about for 2050. But at the same time, we still pass through 2030. And there'll be time for questions after, if I ever stop talking. I'm happy to delve into some of this because there's some really interesting intricacies around how 2050 and 2030 play out in terms of decisions you make today. And the other important thing about net zero is, whereas in the past, very few people agreed to the various timelines and targets, everyone agrees to net zero. So oil companies support net zero, cities support net zero, companies and countries, and everyone's all behind net zero. So just based on that, you need to be suspicious about net zero, because if an oil company agrees to net zero and environmental groups agree to net zero, there must be something going on, and there is, and we can talk about that more too. So we have a global consensus around net zero, and the main transition pathway for net zero is to electrify everything. And not everyone likes that phrase, electrify everything, because it sounds too simplistic, but it is a good working term. Almost everything we do today that uses fossil fuel to create heat or create power or to be used in an industrial process will ultimately be electrified. There's a lot of things that won't be, but basically most will be. One thing that we need to do as we electrify the system and transition our energy systems is make sure that we do everything more efficiently. So efficiency in everything we do, from making buildings more efficient to industry more efficient, is a critical part. And it's kind of slipping a bit off the, I've noticed slipping a bit off the radar, just because so much focus is on the energy systems. And I won't run through all of these things, there's a lot here, but basically electrifying the economy, electrifying the world is where we are headed. So let's take a look in a little bit more detail on electricity. So it is the core pillar for decarbonization. It's estimated that global demand will triple between 2020 and 2050 for electricity. So essentially, if you look at because we're taking all of the things that currently use gasoline or natural gas and we're going to electrify them, then of course it means we're going to have a huge increase in electricity demand. And that was, I was going to say, Lauren, in the work that you supported at the very outset, the triple number was in the modeling work done by the Trottier Energy Futures project, where Lauren and I first met. Direct electrification of transportation and heating will increase demand worldwide. And then, of course, there will be huge economic activities. And what's interesting is for right now, we're talking about just trying to convert our fossil fuel into electricity. For much of the world, they're still facing energy poverty, which means they don't have access to adequate electricity or adequate energy of any kind. So the idea is through distributed electricity systems and renewable power, it'll actually advance many countries as the world expands in renewables. And then the one area that's, I would say, still, the very, very strong disagreements among different experts is the role of hydrogen. And this also plays out politically in Canada. So if you're in Quebec, everyone kind of rolls their eyes, and if you're in Alberta, everyone says, well, that's going to be half of the solution, because a lot of the hydrogen in Alberta, well, almost all of it right now, comes from natural gas. So you don't burn the natural gas, but you extract the hydrogen from natural gas. So it's useful in that it gives a lot of Albertans hope that they can participate in the energy transition with a net zero fuel that is hydrogen. So, and there are sectors like steel making that will likely use hydrogen. Heavy freight transport will likely use hydrogen, for example. But the jury's a little bit out on some of that. So if we look at renewables around the world, we're seeing a huge shift again from electricity that right now has about 36% of CO2 emissions in electricity. But what we're going to see ultimately, of course, by 2050 is the removal of fossil fuels from the electricity sector as well. So decarbonizing electricity is one of the goals. Canada, as you may know, certainly in Quebec, everyone knows, we have one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world. So we are 84% decarbonized as a country, which is, I think, is probably for any major country. France is similar because of the nuclear power, but Canada really is leading the world on clean electricity. And when we talk about decarbonizing electricity, of course, renewable energy is the primary mechanism. We're in Canada, it's unusual that we have so much hydroelectricity combined with quite a bit of nuclear. But if you look at the cost of the future electricity systems, wind and solar are the most cost competitive of any of the technologies. And you can see this extraordinary growth of wind and solar capacity just since 2005. And if you look at these numbers, so 1,000 gigawatts, which is a terawatt, global electricity generation capacity right now is 7,100. So a seventh of all global electricity now is produced by wind and solar, installed capacity, for those paying attention to the details. And then electric vehicles, and nowhere in Canada is it more obvious that electric vehicles are taking over than right here in Montreal. But if you look again at the numbers, they're a 20 times increase in the number of electric vehicle models just over the last decade. So I think it's clear to say that as a personal transportation pathway, electric vehicles are well on their way to having solved the greenhouse gas issue. There's still a lot to be done around things like public transport, but in North America, unfortunately, that's taken second place. Buildings are one of the trickier sectors to deal with, partly because it takes a long, if you have a new furnace, you typically are going to get another new furnace in 10 or 12 or 20 years. So there's a long lag time in replacing equipment in homes. And it's also challenging getting all the pieces together to do that. So you need the HVAC installing industry, you need the manufacturing capacity. There's people all over the world right now competing just to get the equipment. There's huge labor shortages, there's regulatory barriers, so it's very hard to do some of these things. But what's remarkable already in Europe and the United States, heat pump sales have surpassed natural gas furnace sales. So to me, that's one of the more surprising statistics in all of this. And we're seeing, a multi-billion-dollar market for heat pumps. Canada is quite a bit behind the world on this issue. Another area where I think we can look and see incredibly exciting progress is with Indigenous communities in Canada. And so there's two excellent organizations, Indigenous Clean Energy and the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and this other group that works together in another part of the world, Australia, First Nations Clean Energy Network, are building capacity within communities to decarbonize, to make homes more efficient, to put in heat pumps, to get off of diesel. And Indigenous Clean Energy, the organization in Canada that represents, I think, well over 100 Indigenous communities, they've been tracking, Indigenous ownership, the value of the projects, the number of people employed. So this is, if there's any one issue where we're seeing multiple challenges being solved, Indigenous reconciliation, better homes, healthier homes, better air quality in those communities, it's really the intersection between clean energy and Indigenous communities. Okay, now we're getting a little bit into the bad part. So you may have heard, I'm sure you have heard, that what came out of the Paris climate talks, the COP meetings in Paris, was initially that we were going to aim for a maximum 2-degree warming. And then toward the end of the COP meeting, someone got really excited and said, hey, we should shoot for 1.5. And everyone was like, yeah, rah, 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 1.5. So everyone agreed that 1.5 should be the target. So we are right now, depending on which reports you look at, but we're roughly at 1.2 degrees of warming right now. So, and that's a 2022 number. If we looked at this year, I think we're probably pushing up to 1.4. So if we basically turned off every single thing that uses fossil fuel in the world right now, we would go past 1.5, just based on what's emitted in the world. So 1.5 is not a realistic target. I get a little frustrated hearing people continue to talk about trying to reach 1.5. 2 degrees is going to be a very tough target to meet. If we do everything, not even if we do everything, if we do more than everything that we've already committed to in terms of legislative action, maybe we would meet 2 degrees. But really, we're probably looking at something closer to pushing up to 3 degrees, which is actually hugely problematic. So we do need to do much more than we're currently doing today. So that's a challenge. This is, it's funny, one of my colleagues sort of sent this or a variation of this to me, and when your colleagues find graphs scary, that your colleagues maybe are a little nerdy. But this was a particular graph that just came out last week that shows ocean surface temperatures in the world. And in 2023, the surface temperatures are so much higher than anyone has ever recorded that people are really, really quite concerned. So I'd avoid a vacation in Florida in, say, October to November during hurricane season. I imagine it's going to be quite something this year. Again, the whole issue of 1.5 degrees, not only is it going to be a challenge, or are we sort of not going to make it globally, interestingly enough, the Maritimes, I had no idea why the Maritimes, but the Maritimes and the Canadian Arctic have already surpassed 1.5 degrees. And in parts of the Arctic, it's pushing up to 3 degrees, 2.5 to 3 degrees. So we are already at the point of quite significant climate change happening right now, and as I'm sure you hear why the Arctic is so vulnerable. So it's vulnerable to the change, but it's also seeing more change than almost anywhere in the world. So this is why in Canada we need to be so focused on this. The important thing here is to not get overly depressed about the fact that we're going to hit 1.5, we're probably going to hit 2, maybe a little higher, but that every 0.1 degree increment causes more harm and more damage. So it's what it should do is mobilize us and motivate us to actually go harder and go faster on solving this problem, because every choice we make today is going to have a significant impact in the future. So, what is causing Canada to perform poorly? And I'm sure anyone that was paying attention in the first couple of slides will know the answer to this. And it's the same answer for all these questions. Why are emissions up 21%? What industry is causing the major blockage to action on climate globally and in Canada? Which industry is increasing its emissions more than all other sources combined? What industry is behind the spreading of false information to delay climate action? And what industry continues to stall, delay, and criticize politicians attempting to solve climate change and protect the planet? And I think that's going to be pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to mention it, but it's there is one big sector. And in Canada, we have a challenge in that whereas we've seen this significant reduction in emissions from the electricity sector, the oil and gas sector in the same amount of time is increasing, and it is the only sector that is increasing in the country. So we've got a specific problem here in that, as I mentioned, because we're we produce more oil and gas per capita than almost any country in the world, probably outside of the Middle East. So we have a disproportionate problem that is making it quite difficult for us to deal with our emission reductions. Where you would think we would have an opportunity is the extraordinary profits that the oil and gas companies are making right now. So in 2022, unprecedented $34.7 billion in profits just from the Canadian oil sands companies. And this is profits. This isn't how much money they made. This is how much money they get to keep after running everything. $34.7 billion. And what they're still saying today is the only way they can clean up their act is if the government gives them money so that they can invest in the technologies that they claim are going to work. And we've seen in which is carbon capture and storage, CCS. But out of that $35 billion, they've invested less than $1 billion in trying to solve the climate problem. And they've had a good 20 years. In fact, it was in the 1970s when Exxon basically, like about the very, very first understanding ever of the risks of climate change, it was Exxon. And but they buried all that information, and so still today we've got the big oil and gas companies that are really the problem globally and the problem in Canada. So those are the Canadian statistics. Over $200 billion in profits for the major oil companies globally, and still only peanuts being spent on what they claim to be the solution for them, which is carbon capture and storage. The other side, and this is, I sort of debated putting this in because it's the argument that the kind of the far right uses all the time for why Canada shouldn't do anything, which is, well, but what about China? And so you could show one graph of China and see how China has more miles of electric rail than any country in the world, or China has more electric vehicles than any country in the world, more installed solar power than any country in the world. Basically, China has more fill in the blanks than any country in the world, except democracy. But I said I wasn't going to get political. They just announced, and this was just like a few weeks ago, they announced that they were about to increase the number of coal-fired power plants that they were building. They had slowed down, but now with the uptick in the economy post-COVID, they're now back on track to building the equivalent of 2 coal-fired coal-fired power plants a week. So in Canada, we're having a huge debate about something called the Clean Electricity Regulation, which the government's about to release any day now, probably in July. And the sticking point is that we've got 9 coal-fired power plants remaining in Canada, and we need to figure out how to shut those 9 coal-fired power plants. China has 1,250 coal-fired power plants, and will have built 9 more in the next 6 weeks. So this is like a mind-bogglingly challenging thing to try to get your head around. And so I'll just go on the next slide. So the problem that I think that we've had historically, and this is where I'm going to start to wrap up a little bit here, is trying to explain in part why we've had such a difficult time dealing with climate change, why it's taken us 30 years until we actually have a government that's got a plan, and why we still have people that are successfully fighting it, is because it's been framed almost exclusively as an environmental issue. And so it creates this false dichotomy between jobs and the environment, or as we're seeing more and more in politics, populist politics, it's an elite issue versus a populist issue, a rural issue versus an urban issue. And so everything that we do needs to try to reduce those kinds of polarized views. And really, when we're looking at the solution, we need to look at things that people really care about. So affordable housing, housing quality, Indigenous reconciliation, economic opportunity, food security. Those are all the things that need to be built into everything that we do when we talk about climate change. And I think ultimately what we need to recognize is that, or we need to move away from, is this controversy and move into what we call kind of the solution space. So where are we solving the problem together, as opposed to where are we pointing fingers and being overly critical, except the oil industry, which makes sense. Ultimately, we need to work on this notion of kind of a shared vision for where we're trying to get to on climate change. And in very simple terms, this is how I describe the challenge. So we have the old economy, which is run by fossil energy, and we have the new economy, which is run by clean energy. And the debate we're having right now is basically, if you look at kind of the slopes of those two triangles, the old economy is trying to extend that slope as long as possible. And for the new economy, we're trying to accelerate that slope as quickly as possible, because you can't get rid of oil and gas unless you've got an alternative. And you're not going to be building the alternative as long as you've got a lot of oil and gas. So those two things have to happen in tandem in a very sophisticated dynamic where we're winding down the historic fossil fuel economy as we build out the new economy. And there's a reason why this is all reasonably complex, but I'm going to give the federal government credit. I think they are working very hard with this dynamic, and a lot of the pieces are in place right now. The challenge is it's going to take several more years before we see the effects of it, and it'll be just a little slower than we would like in terms of meeting our goals. So I've been working now for, as I said, for like 30 years on these issues. And what's, I think, become clear when you look at organizations that are succeeding is there are sort of better ways for us to be working together. And a lot of this, as my day job is running the Ivy Foundation, a lot of this we've kind of embodied over the last 10 years in our work. So convening regularly is really important, and convening with as many people as possible, with as many diverse perspectives as possible, representing regions of the country and all of the diversity of our country. So, and while you're convening, you need to analyze and understand what the systems are that you're working in, and you need to listen and lead. And these are sort of the principles that we adopt. Also, even when you're doing analytical work, you need to be combining cultural, social, and political approaches. Too often, in fact, I describe it somewhat disparagingly to some of my colleagues, that there's two fundamental approaches to convening. There are the one that I call people without data, and the other one I call data without people. And so what you really need to do is get people in a room with data, working together to understand how to solve these problems. And part of what we've done is help build some new collaborative institutions with our colleagues that are focused very much on solving specific problems. And just to name quite a few, and again, we work closely with the Trottier Family Foundation and with the McConnell Foundation on helping build these institutions. And I think we're starting to see the results of these organizations being more successful in convincing governments, convincing businesses, working with the finance sector. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll just highlight one on here, which is called Canadian Colleges for Resilient Recovery. And this was a spin-off of a project that we were working on. And with a very small amount of money, they basically hired a coordinator and convened, I think, 21 cégeps and community colleges across the country, recognizing that skills development was such an important part of this. And with that small grant, they were able to convert that into a $50 million grant from the federal government for all of these community colleges to develop micro accreditation programs to help with everything from electric vehicles, heat pumps, et cetera, all the things we need to do. So, I'm excited when we see those kinds of things start to actually happen and see them being implemented. And they're now shooting for another 150 million, so that would be very exciting. The one, Subhas has mentioned that I'm on the board of something called the Transition Accelerator, and this was an organization that also with our same group of colleagues I mentioned, Trottier and McConnell, we've been supporting for a number of years, and it's very specifically created these kind of like partners for action from industry, organized labor. So each of these have representation from industry, organized labor, indigenous nations, finance companies, and others. And the idea is to sort of move the climate change solution out of it being something that the government is trying to do. This is one of my critiques of government, is they're trying to own the problem and own the solution and create everything themselves, to basically get these big consortia of people who themselves are solving the problem. So Electrifying Canada is over 30 organizations, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition I mentioned, banks, et cetera, all the major electricity industry players. The Building Decarbonization Alliance just announced a few weeks ago with over 80 businesses, again, labor working across the country, very specifically to try to crack the challenge of accelerating heat pump installation in Canada. So a very focused mandate, everyone in the room that needs to be there to help make this happen. The Hydrogen Hub in Edmonton, Accelerate, which is a zero emission vehicle supply chain group. So what we're seeing is activity on the ground with business across the country working to try to solve these problems. And they're not going to go away because they all represent everything from major corporations like mining companies like Teck and Cameco, right down to small lithium battery companies and others. So very exciting, very positive. We're seeing that these essentially are like pathway organizations working on specific net zero pathways. If we look at the results of not necessarily specifically of that work, but if you look at where we're going, I recall having conversations even probably as recently as 4 years ago, thinking, well, what's Ontario going to do? We've got a premier who doesn't believe in climate change and an auto industry that's going to go down the tubes. And here we are 4 years later, and the story I heard from someone internally was the CEO went to the Minister of Finance and said, look, we're on the auto industry, we don't care about climate change either. I'm making that part up. But you need to invest in us or we won't be making cars in Ontario anymore. And automobile industry is about 25% of the Ontario economy. So in the last couple of years, we've seen massive investments in cathode production, which are the components of batteries that go into cars and other things, in electric vehicle plants, in lithium mines, recently announced here in Quebec. So, I've kind of gone from, wow, we're way behind the curve on this, to we are now one of the leading countries in the world looking at battery manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing, cathode manufacturing, and critical minerals to make all of the future technologies that we will be needing. So super exciting across the board. Huge recent investments in Canada as well. A company from Greece announcing a $1.7 billion solar project in Alberta. It's going to be the largest solar project in Canada. Huge offshore wind projects in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, some of those combined with onshore hydrogen production. So massive multi-billion-dollar investments happening in the Maritimes. And so finally, I think we can use all of that to try to, coming back to the challenge of how do we explain all this to people, is basically by focusing on opportunity, focusing on possibility, focusing on solution, and using those transition pathways to really understand that there's only, you know, a handful of things that we need to do, that we will, I think, be able to get people to understand that this isn't the big, scary, difficult thing that it's often made out to be, that we're well on our way. We've got huge investments, businesses are working on it, government's behind it, and I think, you know, more than anything, to see that the transition really is happening now. I think it's always important, it came up when I was talking to Monica at the outset, the whole issue of climate anxiety. Climate anxiety is a real thing. I think we need to be aware of that. And I think anything that we can do to frame climate change solutions in terms of the issues that people care about, we're going to be able to move much further in advancing these issues. And when you dig down into that, so basically all these points are the same point over and over again, but if you dig down into that, what that means is you need to understand people's values, you need to work with their values, and you need to create messages that are aligning with people's values. So that's one of the conclusions of the many years of work that we've been doing. So in terms of a call to action, so we need to understand how and why change happens, and we need to basically look at what the motivators are for that. So learning from what's worked and keeping in mind, and part of my thinking is for people who go off, and whether it's in their organizations, whether it's just in conversations they're having, or whether it's part of their professional work, you know, everyone has their own sphere of influence, and I think it's important to keep these things in mind just when you're having conversations with people or using your organizations for change. So I think when we look at these various organizations that we've helped create and helped convene, when they're focused on collaboration and convening, it's really important to understand who needs to be in a room for that conversation, and it's equally important to understand who shouldn't be in the room for that conversation. And I was explaining, I was at a Climate Institute board meeting the other day and was saying that one of the important structures of the Climate Institute is that there's a series of expert panels, and the experts are the people who do the research that come up with the findings that influence the policy. And there's a separate group of stakeholders, an advisory council that's got about 50 or 60 stakeholders representing everything from industry to youth to others. And what often gets confused, and what particularly gets confused by our federal government, is that there is a big difference between a stakeholder and an expert. And if you want to solve a problem, you get together with experts. If you want to see how people react to the problem, you get together with stakeholders. It's a very fundamentally different thing that remarkably, it seems government is still unaware of. So we need to, I think this is going to be the very end, think about a lot of these problems in new ways, and we have to create space for solutions and space for people who are comfortable with those solutions. And I think with that, we can also be radical and we can be pragmatic. Thank you very much. And I'm more than happy to take questions. Yes, hi.
Representatives of the oil industry participating in these organizations as, I guess, stakeholders.
Yeah. Oh, right. Sorry, I was going to mention that. I can repeat that though. There's, but yeah, in future there's a microphone because I think this is being recorded. So the question was, are representatives of the oil industry involved in these various, I guess, initiatives and stakeholder events or organizations? In the ones that I presented, I'm going to say not so much, except maybe the Edmonton Hydrogen Hub. So, yeah, I think, I'm trying to think of others that, like, to be honest, I was doing a lot of work with the oil and gas industry for quite a few years, and what I found just in the last couple of years, as the climate policy environment has become so much clearer, it's basically created a much more tension in the system. So you've seen, you know, Alberta just had an election while the country was on fire, and no one mentioned climate change. Like it's that wacky. So unfortunately, in my view, is the oil and gas industry has dug their heels in. Their strategy going forward is to extract as much oil and gas as they possibly can and get it out of the country as quickly as they can and make as much money as they can possibly make, and that's it. I don't really see any real. So one of my slides that said, and who shouldn't be in the room? If someone is fundamentally opposed to what you're trying to do, they shouldn't be in the room. So I'm a little bit more frustrated than I was 5 years ago dealing with the oil and gas industry, but they've really dug in, so to speak. Yes. And yeah, do you mind going to the microphone?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Hi there. I'm Hayden Smith. I work for BX Ventures, which is Canada's first clean tech venture studio.
Oh, awesome.
Loved your presentation. I'm so inspired to see the optimism and the hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Lourie. My question is about, I was at the Climate Solutions Festival 2 weeks ago, and the opening keynote was a wonderful presentation from a gentleman who explained that we're already at 5 degrees C above pre-industrial temperature rise. He explained that basically by the fact that we're at 420 ppm in the atmosphere, and the last time we were at that level was something like 8 million years ago, and records basically show us that that was corresponding with 5 degrees C. What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't think 8 million years ago is a particularly useful measure. I mean, basically all of this is based on pre-industrial, so, you know, early 1800s versus today, and it's based on, you know, temperature records. Like it's, I think he's got the wrong thermometer.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, no, absolutely. I loved your presentation. My name is Noah Coserato. I just finished my first year undergrad in Chem Eng here at McGill. And I was wondering specifically, and I know this is more of like an application situation-based question, but do you find that investment in renewable and energy storage systems or smart grids would be more suitable for the future? And which one do you think would provide a larger impact both in the first and the third world?
Well, that's a great question. A little bit probably out of my expertise, but I will say energy storage is fundamental. And if you imagine, actually I had a smart, or maybe it was in here, I can't remember, I had a smart grid image. So of course there's the challenge with a lot of this is everything has to happen way faster than it's happening now. And it's not, do we do this or do we do this? We do it all and we do it fast and we need investment. So I would say they're equally critical. I think in terms of a very specific technology, like storage is a more understandable thing. Smart grids really are a little bit more of an integration activity. So it takes, you know, it's a little, I mean, from my sense would be, it's a little bit more of a combination of a software solution and an institutional change solution happening together, whereas storage, whether it's pumped water or large batteries are critical. But I'm going to say, they're equally important. And one thing that we also mentioned, I organized a symposium here of 6 or so weeks ago, and we had several presentations from professors at McGill and outside of McGill talking about storage and specifically battery technologies. And what you realize, what's fascinating and why it's been such a pleasure for me, Sebastis, to be here, is you get exposed to ideas that are 10 years ahead of where they're actually at in kind of popular understanding. And the extent to advancements in battery technology, storage, sodium batteries, for example, for stationary batteries, there's just so much opportunity there. So I think I'll go and say storage is the one that you should focus on. I've just talked myself into it. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Hugh Cameron, and I have another storage-related question. If you look on the Hydro-Quebec website, it's stated that the hydroelectric reservoirs of Hydro-Quebec contain enough water to power the entire province for about 10 or 11 months. Okay. But if Hydro-Quebec turned on those generators full-time, the reservoirs would be drained in about 10 or 11 months because the maximum, because they're built for peak output.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why do we not have a program of building the same amount of wind turbine capacity in the far north and cross-connecting the output to the hydroelectric generators so that when the wind is blowing, we don't need to drain the reservoirs. Mm-hmm. And this would approximately double the capacity of Hydro-Quebec without any need for additional storage. And the additional storage would cost, that much storage would cost about $200 billion. Why isn't this happening?
No, it's a good question. Part of it would be the economics, because right now Hydro-Quebec has, not for much longer I don't think, but has surplus electricity within the existing system that for Hydro-Quebec's needs, that would be sort of redundant and expensive. The conversation that we, in fact, also with my work with Trottier, where we were working on for a couple of years, is the recognition that you can use Hydro-Quebec storage to basically balance both the wind capacity that they're building in the U.S. and also accelerate the closure of coal plants in the U.S. And because essentially this has to be, like an economic transaction of some kind. So Hydro-Quebec selling electricity as they do, to places like New York and Massachusetts. So, but even that, with a very clear economic argument, is still hard to do. Partly because people are, fighting transmission lines and things like that. So it's the fundamental idea is that you're describing is exactly right. You can use hydro dams to balance power systems, and you can use intermittent wind to basically balance against the hydro system. So, that idea is being developed, and I think everyone understands it. It's just the scale and the economics are a little tricky.
It's a question of scale and getting the right people in the room then. And the economics aren't quite there right now for Quebec to do something like that. But it's not alone, but in Canada we just spent $500 billion on COVID. We're frustrated because it makes sense that, anyway, this is a whole other long conversation, but Canada has quite a dysfunctional electricity system, right? So I don't know if you remember when Texas had the big blackout, and if you read anything about what was going on in the US, Texas is the only state that doesn't connect with all the other states around it. And they're not part of what's called an integrated kind of system operator. And Canada is essentially a bunch of Texases. So we don't have any integrated systems at any meaningful scale. So we could use hydro in British Columbia to get off of coal and gas in Alberta. We could use hydro in Manitoba to get off coal in Saskatchewan. We can use hydro in Quebec to balance Ontario's intermittent wind and solar. That's politics. That's not even economics. So that's your answer.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this wonderful invitation, the most wonderful presentation. I'm sure everybody agrees. I'm actually from an urban planning background, and we've done leaps and bounds here in Quebec regarding net zero construction in terms of our subway. So we're in the forefront of globally with our wonderful subway construction. But my concern is, as I mentioned in different municipalities, during the failure of the power grid, during our electrical power failures, there's been people this winter, I was stuck for 5 days without power, and other people up to 10 days. It was the biggest power failure this year. The question is, in this magical grid system, what is your backup solution to, on a municipal level? I mean, do you just take everybody out of their houses and put them into the gym? What is your perception? Because I know that the Canadian Federation of Municipalities has a green program, and I think you should be working for them to come up with backup solutions on a municipal level for power failures. I mean, do you throw everybody in the gym? What is it that you perceive to do?
It's certainly a challenge. And so if you look at any of the future planning around electricity systems, you'll see the word resilience always mentioned. And this is, frankly, this is also one of the consequences of climate change, right? Ice storms, heat, wind storms that are causing power failures. And the way you can increase resilience, I mean, a simple way that we don't do here in Canada, but they do in, say, in Europe, is you bury power lines, but our distances are quite significant. But the other thing you can do is have more smart grids and have more local distributed energy. So if you have a system, so Quebec is particularly vulnerable because you have a small number of very large facilities a long, long way from where the power is used. The more you can get to a system where you've got, like local local wind or energy projects combined with storage facilities. I mean, storage will help, like battery storage, backup storage will help for these things. But, and smart grids where you can actually, you can disconnect a small part of the grid to protect the rest of it. That's one of the challenges with these big outages is once the power starts to go out, then it affects the entire system because you can't disconnect the smaller subsets. So it's a big conversation. It's happening everywhere. People are aware of it, and it's one of the reasons why governments and utilities are afraid of electrification as the solution. Because it's one thing when your power goes out and maybe you have an electric stove. It's another thing when your power goes out and you don't have a car and you don't have heat and you can't cook. Like suddenly you can't do anything when the power goes out. So you've put your finger on a very significant issue, and I would say it's not entirely solved.
But storage, for extra storage collectors, you can put them underneath the fire stations, you can put them underneath the gym.
You can have them in your basement.
Yeah.
You can. Everyone can
for
have.
Emergency.
Can have batteries.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Not at all.
Thank you for the excellent talk, quite humorous too, which is always nice. I had a question, the comment earlier on PPMs in the atmosphere and stuff got me thinking, what do you see the role of kind of active carbon capture in the future? Because that wasn't really mentioned in your talk. And also, maybe a spin-off of that, how do you see the role of circular economics fitting into the overall picture of trying to bring down the carbon emissions? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they're good. Good question. So I think direct air capture will be a significant part in the future. If you look at studies, there's a a really great net zero study done at Princeton. And they show that the significance of carbon capture post-2050. And so basically the idea is we try to mitigate as much as we can, try to reduce emissions as much as we can. We're not going to get where we need to get to through mitigation. So we're going to have to start extracting carbon out of the air. But the prediction is that the technology, the scalability, and the cost effectiveness of those technologies, it's going to be pushing us up to 2050. So it's going to be kind of like the save our skins at the end of the day technology as opposed to the solve the problem technology. And your second one, oh, circular economics. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and it's I mean, I've sometimes referred to it as fancy recycling. So I don't know. It's being used in so many different ways by so many different people, and not always in a good way, that I'm to be honest, a little skeptical.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk, and I guess that answer partly answered my question that I was going to ask. Though I'm a fan of saying that a little bit of something is better than 100% of something, I think climate solve may be a bit of an exaggeration, because energy is only a piece of the CO2 puzzle, and CO2 is only a piece of the greenhouse gas puzzle. How do we attack these other big pieces? Do you have any idea, or do we? It seems to me like they're going to be a lot more challenging, many of them, but I'm curious to see what you have to say about this.
Yeah, do you mean things like agriculture? You think?
Agriculture, cement,
yeah,
plastics,
yeah.
Roads.
Yeah, so I mean, I include some of that in this. I mean, agriculture has its own whole stream, but cement certainly is, to me, just part of the understanding energy and fossil fuel piece. So, I mean, I would say, you know, at least 70% of the problem is in the energy system. Agriculture is fascinating and tricky. If you look at sort of where, you know, I think a lot in terms of kind of how things transition. So the agriculture sector is probably 20 years behind most other sectors in terms of like where they're at and thinking and actions on this. There's some really great activities that are happening. My friend Jane and I, who got Farmers for Climate Solutions going, for example. So there are farm groups now in every province of the country working exactly on this issue, and they're starting to make some traction. I think we're going to see over the next 5 years a big focus on agriculture. So I think it's just behind in terms of the scale, and things like that people aren't really talking. I mean, we're talking about the health effects of forest fires, and forest fires, you know, being caused by climate change. They're not talking about the fact that, and then all those forest fires are contributing to climate change. Like, so it's those feedback loops are going to be really complicated. And I would say, so if you look at those categories that I dismissed at the beginning, like which you're focusing on, so land use and waste and agriculture, they're trickier and not nearly as well developed, but they're important.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Darcy. It was a pretty good talk. Yeah, thanks for being here. Okay, so I'd like to know your opinion on the role of protests in uprooting fossil fuel dominance, ranging from legal means such as like marching in the street and whatnot to illegal means such as like blockades and even sabotage. Thanks.
Yeah, it's starting to get tempting. You know, I was the chair of the board of environmental defense for a lot of years, and we had a lot of activist campaigns on the oil industry. And I mean, the frustrating part is I'm not sure that any of it has really worked that well. You know, if you think about the oil industry, and the conclusion I've come to is the oil industry has one job: dig oil out of the ground, I think I said this already, export it, and make a lot of money. And so trying to tell them that that's not their job isn't going to work. It's the government's job to regulate them in a way that's going to save the planet. It's not the oil industry's job to self-regulate. So that's kind of a fundamental, I think, challenge in some of the campaigning stuff. I mean, having said that, we're actively looking at some new campaign strategies against the oil industry. And when you said legal and illegal, what I was thinking was legal as in suing oil companies. I think suing oil companies is a really great strategy, and we're starting to see more and more of that globally. And I think that's ultimately, it's going to be like the tobacco industry. That's what's going to get the oil industry. It's going to be taking them to court and suing them for lying, suing them for destroying the planet, suing them for causing all the damage they're causing. And I'm going to guess that that's going to be the successful strategy for the oil industry.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Michael. I work in the energy business, and we make engines, and so it's interesting to hear about like the oil and gas industry. So I have maybe a question that's like you said, it's the government's role to be regulating. They shouldn't be self-regulating, and ultimately they're delivering a product that's like in demand in the world. Like someone's got to mine the coal to feed those 2 power plants every week. Like we got to have more and more mines. So it's a kind of a thing together. But I guess my question's like, what's our ambition in Canada? I guess like I could see that transition down. It's like there's this concern I feel in the discourse around Canada that if we're not exporting oil and gas, like what are we doing? Where are we going to get the money? Like we can be exporting new stuff, like you're talking about hydrogen, lots of electricity, exporting down. So like where's our ambition? Where's that conversation around like the incredible richness that we could have by generating additional solar and wind all across the country, exporting it, making clean chemicals, clean materials, exporting those around the world, and that's somehow a carrot, I don't know, for the industry of the future somehow?
Yeah, no, I hear bang on, and we organized a meeting, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years ago, and we got the political staffers from several departments, and including the Prime Minister's office together, kind of pitching that idea. And it just kind of fell flat. Like the government just didn't kind of get it. And it was a big pitch, like, you know, buy Canada, go Canada, kind of let's just sell Canada to the world. Because we have among the, you know, as I said, the cleanest electricity, the most sustainable forest. We've got like it, you know, there's a legitimacy to the quality of Canadian products and the sustainability. So I would say I mean, it came up. We just did a whole bunch of meetings in Ottawa, and we brought together a bunch of sort of clean tech companies and other companies, and that idea came up. So I think it's still promising that we might see some of that. We pulled together something, and then just someone gave it a name. It's called New Economy Canada, and the idea of New Economy Canada really is to represent that upward wedge. And there were like over 50 businesses, and they had meetings with representatives of every political party in the Prime Minister's office, and there was a lot of excitement around it. So, no, I think you're exactly onto something. I think Canadians do a poor job of kind of promoting themselves and representing themselves internationally. So I agree 100%.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Mary Kang. I'm an assistant professor in civil engineering at McGill. I do methane emissions measurements from oil and gas and urban systems. You know, I wanted to ask a question about government structures, and maybe within a Canadian context. Of course, government is not the only solution or only way to solve this problem, but it's part of the approach or part of the infrastructure to do that. So can you talk a little bit about the Canadian system where the provinces have quite a bit of power? For example, in oil and gas, the oil and gas is regulated at the provincial level. So when I think about production. So can you talk a little bit about potential for change in the political systems, or I mean, I know that's very difficult to do, but if there's any ideas on how we can make the infrastructure more efficient, the political infrastructure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's nice to see you, Mary. We chatted on email. That's actually, I didn't really touch on that at all, but it is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Canada is the way the federation is structured. So I always describe to people outside of Canada that Canada is much more like the EU than it is like a country, right? Each province has extraordinary autonomy in terms of, and it's not just energy, it's everything, like all resources, environmental regulations, the delivery of healthcare, education. Like basically we've got, 10 countries and a couple of satellites up north, and then a federal government that's kind of trying to string it all together through bribes. Like that's how our system works, and it's not that great. So we're just about to see, like the Alberta government and the Saskatchewan government are going to be suing the federal government many times over the next year as the federal government issues their things like the clean electricity regulation, the methane regulation, the oil and gas cap. Like they're going to get sued for all of those. It's quite a dysfunctional system. And then I was mentioning the electricity systems, right? Which, like, you can't even, like BC and Alberta were just on the verge of signing a deal to export, hydropower from BC into Alberta. And then one of the governments changed and they just decided they weren't going to. And also all the Alberta companies, which are private, so Alberta has a completely deregulated electricity system, and British Columbia is BC Hydro. And all of the private companies in Alberta were afraid that the BC hydropower that was going to come in was going to be so much cheaper than the power that they were producing that it would undercut the market. They would lose their investments and go bankrupt because of the system. So anyway, I'm certainly not providing an answer to your question. I'm just basically saying it is one of the single biggest problems we have. Where we're trying, I do a lot of work on electricity, which is why I'm referring to it, but where we're trying to move on that, and the government just announced a new electricity advisory council that I'm involved with, and the goal there is to try to create regional coordinating bodies that would basically help make decisions across provinces. So they would be separate bodies, they wouldn't have legal jurisdiction, but they would actually allow for regional planning. And I think we need more of that in Canada, sort of like a smart group of people looking at a region and saying, okay, why don't you work together on this, as opposed to politically driven individual provinces competing with each other and arguing with each other, which is not a great system. And that's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for that really thoughtful presentation and comments, and really for defining such a pathway forward succinctly. That was great. So I would just like to conclude by thanking you all for coming. It's great to see such a great turnout. My thanks to the staff for all the arrangements, the AV. And we have a reception right next door. So please enjoy the refreshments and carry on the conversation. Thank you.